My name is Megan Sinclair, and I am 30 years old. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am a registered nurse. I have worked in emergency departments. I have held the hands of strangers while they coded on gurneys. I have watched people die. I tell you this not because it makes me special, but because when I say that I knew exactly what was happening to my body at 3:47 on a Sunday morning in January, I need you to believe me. I knew. And knowing made it worse, mice. I had been feeling off for about 2 days, a dull, persistent ache on my right side, just below my ribs, radiating into my back. I told myself it was stress. I had just come off 4 consecutive 12-hour shifts at the Royal Alexandra Hospital in Edmonton, and my body was tired in the way that only night shift nurses understand. Tired in the bones, tired behind the eyes, the kind of tired where you pour orange juice into your coffee and don't notice until the 3rd sip. I figured the pain was muscular. Maybe I had twisted wrong while repositioning a patient. Maybe I had slept on it funny. I took 2 extra strength Tylenol and went to bed. At 3:47 a.m., the pain woke me up like someone had reached inside my body and twisted something with both hands. I gasped and rolled sideways off my bed, landing hard on the floor of my apartment. The carpet was rough against my cheek. I could feel my pulse in my abdomen, which is not where you want to feel your pulse. I knew immediately. Gallbladder. Possibly ruptured, possibly worse. I crawled to the nightstand where my phone was charging, and I called 911. I want to be very clear about this. I called 911 first. I am a nurse. I know what to do in an emergency. The dispatcher was calm and professional and told me an ambulance was being sent. And then she told me something that made my stomach drop even further than it already had. There had been a major collision on the Henday, a multi-vehicle pileup involving a jackknifed semi, and the estimated wait time for a unit to reach my neighborhood in Mill Woods was approximately 40 to 50 minutes. She stayed on the line with me. She was kind. But 40 to 50 minutes, when you are lying on the floor and your body is telling you in every language it knows that something is rupturing inside you, is not a number that gives you comfort. So I called my mother. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. The voicemail greeting was the same one she had recorded in 2019. Her voice, slightly too loud, slightly too cheerful, the way people sound when they know they are being recorded. "You've reached Diane. I can't come to the phone right now. Leave me a message and I'll get back to you." I called again. Same thing. I called my father's phone. It didn't even ring. Straight to that 3-tone chime that tells you the phone is either dead or switched off. I called my mother again. Again. Between each call, the pain was getting worse. I was sweating through my pajama shirt. My teeth were chattering even though my apartment was warm. I could feel something shifting inside me, something wrong, something leaking, and I know how that sounds, but that is the only way I can describe it. I felt wet inside in a place that should not feel wet. I called 14 times total, 7 to my mother, 7 to my father. I know the exact number because I looked at my call log later, lying in a hospital bed, scrolling through it like I was reading a story about someone else. On the last call to my mother, I left a voicemail. My voice was so strained it barely sounded like me. I said, "Mom, something is really wrong. I'm on the floor. I called an ambulance, but it's going to be a long time. Please call me back. Please. I'm really scared." I have never in my adult life told my mother that I was scared. I was raised in a family where fear was treated as a character flaw, where being tough was the price of admission to being loved, or at least to being acknowledged. Saying those words out loud, into a voicemail, in the dark, on my floor, cost me something I still haven't gotten back. Nobody called me back. What happened next is the reason I am telling this story at all. My neighbor, a man named Douglas Beaulieu, 63 years old, retired millwright from Suncor, a man I had spoken to maybe a dozen times in the 2 years I had lived in that building, mostly about the recycling bins or the parking lot or the weather, heard me through the wall. He told me later that he had been up already because his dog, a 14-year-old beagle named Russ, had needed to go outside. He was standing in his kitchen in his housecoat when he heard what he described as a sound like someone trying to scream but not being able to. He knocked on my door. When I didn't answer, he tried the handle. It was unlocked because I had been too exhausted after my last shift to remember to lock it. He found me on my bedroom floor, curled up, soaked in sweat, gray in the face, which was his word, gray. He didn't hesitate. He didn't call out or ask me questions I couldn't answer. He picked me up. He is not a large man, Douglas. He is maybe 5'9", lean the way men who have worked physical jobs their whole lives are lean, all wire and gristle. But he picked me up and he carried me to his truck and he drove me to the Royal Alex himself because he knew, the way people from northern Alberta know things, that waiting was not an option. He broke 2 traffic laws getting me there. He told me this later with a half smile, like he was confessing to something minor. He ran a red light on 111th Avenue and he exceeded the speed limit on the Yellowhead by what he estimated was about 40 kilometers an hour. He said Russ sat in the back seat the entire time, perfectly calm, like this was a normal Sunday drive. I don't remember the drive, I remember fragments, the orange glow of the streetlights. The sound of Douglas talking to me, not the words but the tone, steady and low and constant, the way you talk to a frightened animal. I remember the cold when he opened the passenger door at the emergency entrance, and then I remember nothing at all for a very long time. My gallbladder had ruptured. Bile was leaking into my abdominal cavity. By the time I was on the operating table, I had developed biliary peritonitis, which, if you are not familiar with the term, means that the lining of my abdomen was becoming inflamed and infected from the inside. The surgical team told me later that my blood pressure had dropped dangerously low during the procedure. They used the word critical. They used the word touch and go. One of the nurses, a woman I had actually worked a shift with once, told me afterward that there was a moment in the OR when the attending surgeon asked for something in a voice that made everyone in the room move faster. She said it was the voice that means we are losing this person. They didn't lose me. But it was, as Dr. Okafor later told me, very much a near thing. I woke up in the surgical recovery unit at some point on Sunday afternoon. The light coming through the window was pale and flat, the way winter light looks in Edmonton when the sky is a sheet of unbroken white. I was attached to an IV drip and a heart monitor and a catheter. My mouth was so dry, it felt like the inside of it had been replaced with cardboard. I turned my head and there was a woman sitting in the chair beside my bed, reading a paperback novel. She was in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, with short silver hair and reading glasses pushed down to the tip of her nose. She was wearing a dark blue sweater and gray slacks, and she had a Tim Hortons cup on the side table next to her. I didn't know her. She noticed me looking, and she closed her book and leaned forward and said very gently, "There you are." I tried to speak, but my throat was too raw. She reached over and held a cup of water with a straw to my lips. I took a sip and managed to whisper, "Who are you?" She said her name was Linda Beaulieu. She was Douglas's wife. She told me that Douglas had stayed at the hospital for several hours after bringing me in, but had eventually gone home to take care of Russ and get some sleep. Linda had come to sit with me so that when I woke up, I would not wake up alone. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A woman I had never met, the wife of a man I barely knew, had driven to a hospital on a Sunday and sat in an uncomfortable chair for hours reading a paperback, just so that a stranger would not open her eyes to an empty room. I started to cry, not loudly. My body was too wrecked for loud. But the tears came and they wouldn't stop, and Linda didn't say a single thing about it. She just moved her chair a little closer and put her hand on mine and sat there. She didn't say it would be okay. She didn't say everything was going to be fine. She just stayed. A little while later, Dr. Okafor came in. He was a tall, serious man with a calm demeanor and a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only patient in the entire hospital. He sat down, which doctors only do when they have something significant to say. I know this because I have watched doctors do it hundreds of times from the other side, and he walked me through what had happened. The rupture, the peritonitis, the emergency surgery. The moment my blood pressure dropped. He said I had been very lucky, and then he corrected himself and said that luck was not really the right word. He said that the man who brought me in had quite possibly saved my life by not waiting for the ambulance. I nodded. I was still processing. And then Dr. Okafor's expression shifted slightly, the way a person's face changes when they are about to say something they are not comfortable saying, and he told me something I was not prepared to hear. He said, "Your emergency contact is listed as Diane Sinclair. She was called by the hospital at approximately 6:15 this morning. She arrived here at around 10 light a.m. I felt something lift in my chest for a brief second. My mother had come, and then he continued. He said, "She spoke with the charge nurse and was informed of your condition and the surgery. She was told that you were in recovery and that your prognosis was good, but that you would need to remain in hospital for several days for monitoring and IV antibiotics." He paused. He glanced at Linda briefly, then back at me. "She asked whether you could be transferred to a hospital in Toronto." I stared at him. Toronto. My parents lived in Markham, just outside Toronto. It was a 3.5-hour flight from Edmonton. I had moved to Alberta 5 years earlier for work and for space, and for reasons I didn't fully understand at the time but understand perfectly now. Dr. Okafor continued, He said my mother had been told that transferring me was not medically advisable given my post-operative status. She had then asked whether I could be discharged into her care so that she could arrange a flight home. The charge nurse had explained firmly that discharging me at that point could result in sepsis and that it was not going to happen. He said my mother's response was to become frustrated. He said she had raised her voice at the nursing station. He said she had told the charge nurse that she knew what was best for her daughter and that the family had things going on that required Megan to be closer to home. Things going on. I found out later what the things were. My older sister, Jenna, was getting married in 11 days. The wedding was in Markham. My mother had been planning it for the better part of a year. She had booked the venue, the florist, the caterer, the photographer. She had a spreadsheet, she had a group chat. She had a seating chart laminated and pinned to a corkboard in her kitchen. And her other daughter, the one lying in a hospital bed in Edmonton with a drainage tube coming out of her abdomen, was supposed to be the maid of honor. That was what the things were. My mother had not driven to the hospital because her daughter nearly died. She had come because her daughter nearly died at an inconvenient time. Dr. Okafor told me one more thing before he left. He said that during the exchange at the nursing station, another visitor had intervened. He said a man who had been sitting in the waiting area had stood up and approached the desk and said something to my mother that caused her to leave the floor. Dr. Okafor did not tell me what the man said. He didn't need to. I already knew who it was. Douglas came back that evening. He came in quietly, the way he did everything, and sat in the chair that Linda had been sitting in earlier. Linda had gone home by then. Douglas had changed out of the clothes he had been wearing when he carried me to his truck. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt and dark jeans, and he smelled faintly of soap and cold air, the way people smells when they have just come in from an Alberta winter. I asked him what he had said to my mother. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, very evenly, I told her that her daughter had nearly died on an operating table 6 hours ago, and that if she had come here to talk about a wedding, she should leave and come back when she was ready to talk about her child. He said it the same way he might have said the recycling goes out on Tuesdays. No drama, no flourish. Just the fact of it, laid down like a plank of wood. I asked him how my mother had responded. He said she had looked at him and said, "This is a family matter." And he had said, "Then act like a family." She left after that. She didn't come to my room. She didn't leave a note. She went back to the airport, as I learned later from my sister, and flew home. She told Jenna that I was recovering fine and would probably be out in a day or two, and that the wedding would go ahead as planned. She told Jenna that I was being dramatic. I was lying in a hospital bed with a 6-inch incision across my abdomen, a tube draining infected fluid from my body cavity, an IV pumping antibiotics into my bloodstream, and I was being dramatic. My father called me that evening. It was the first time I had heard from either of them since my 14 calls in the dark. He sounded uncomfortable, the way he always sounded when something emotional was happening, like he was reading from a script that someone had handed him moments before. He said he was glad I was okay. He said my mother was upset. He said, and I am telling you his exact words because they are burned into my memory like a brand. Your mother has put a lot of work into this wedding, Meg. Try to see it from her side. I hung up on him. It was the first time in my life I had ever hung up on my father. My hand was shaking when I put the phone down, but it wasn't from weakness. It was from something else entirely. Something that felt like a door opening inside me. A door I had been leaning against for years without realizing it, and behind it was not anger exactly, but clarity. A terrible, luminous clarity about who these people were versus who I had spent my whole life pretending they were. Douglas visited me every day I was in that hospital. 5 days total. He came in the late afternoon, always around 4 o'clock, always with a Tim Hortons double-double for himself and a tea for me, because he had asked one of the nurses what I was allowed to drink, and she had said tea was fine. He didn't stay long. Maybe 30 or 40 minutes each time. He didn't fill the silence with chatter. He told me about Russ, about the weather, about a shelf he was building in his garage. He told me about his years at Suncor, about the cold mornings on the oil sands, about the northern lights he had seen from the work camp that were so bright they looked fake. He told me about his brother, who had passed away 2 years earlier from pancreatic cancer, and how in those final weeks the thing his brother had wanted most was not treatment or miracles, but simply for someone to sit with him and not look afraid. I think that's why Douglas sat with me the way he did. Not because I was dying, but because he understood that there are moments in life when the thing a person needs most is the physical presence of another human being who is not asking anything of them. He was giving me what he had learned to give from watching someone he loved leave the world. Linda came with him on the third and fourth visits. She brought me a pair of warm socks from Mark's because hospital floors are always freezing, and hospital socks are always too thin. She brought me a magazine and a phone charger because mine had been left behind in my apartment. On the fourth visit, she sat at the edge of my bed and told me something that I think about almost every single day. She said, "You know, sweetheart, the word family gets used like it's a cage sometimes. Like because you were born into something, you owe it your whole life. But family isn't a cage. Family is whoever opens the door and walks in when the world has walked out." She said it simply, like she was telling me the time, and that is what made it land so hard. It was not a speech. It was just a thing she knew to be true, and she was handing it to me. On the fifth day, the day I was discharged, Douglas and Linda drove me home. Not my parents, not my sister, not any of the people whose names were on my birth certificate or in my emergency contacts. Two people whose last name I had learned less than a week ago. They drove me home in Douglas's truck, with Russ sitting in the back seat, calm and dignified as ever. Linda had gone into my apartment earlier that day with the spare key the building manager had provided, and she had cleaned it. She had changed my sheets. She had stocked my fridge with groceries. Soup, bread, orange juice, yogurt, the kinds of things you eat when your body is putting itself back together. There was a note on the kitchen counter in her handwriting that said, "Meals in the freezer, labeled by day. Don't lift anything heavier than a coffee mug for 2 weeks. We mean it. D&L." I stood in my kitchen holding that note, and I cried for the fourth time that week. I had cried when I woke up alone. I had cried when Dr. Okafor told me what my mother had done. I had cried when my father told me to see it from her side, and now I was crying because two people I barely knew had cleaned my apartment and filled my freezer, and left a note that said "We mean it" and signed it with their initials, like it was the most natural thing in the world. My sister's wedding happened 9 days later. I was not there. I was in no condition to fly, and even if I had been, I am not sure I would have gone. My mother called me twice in the days before the wedding. The first time, she asked whether I had spoken to the airline about changing my flight. I told her I was not coming. There was a silence so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Jenna is going to be devastated." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "How are you healing?" Not, "I'm sorry I left you in a hospital without saying goodbye. Jenna is going to be devastated." As if the primary consequence of my ruptured organ was its impact on the seating chart. The second call was the night before the wedding. She had been drinking. I could hear it in the slight looseness of her words, the way her sentences ran together at the edges. She said, "I don't understand what I did wrong, Megan. I came all the way to Edmonton." She said it like Edmonton was a punishment, like the city itself was the unreasonable thing. She said, "That man at the hospital had no right to speak to me that way." She meant Douglas. She called him that man as if he didn't deserve a name, as if the person who had carried her daughter to a truck and broken traffic laws to save her life and then told her the truth she didn't want to hear was an inconvenience rather than a human being. I said, "Mom, he had more right than you think." And I hung up. It was the second time in my life I had hung up on a parent, and it was easier than the first. I found out something else in the weeks that followed, something that Douglas never told me himself because, as I have come to understand about him, he does not do things for credit. The charge nurse, a woman named Priya, told me during a follow-up appointment that Douglas had filed a formal concern with the hospital's patient advocacy office regarding my mother's behavior. He had documented the incident calmly and thoroughly, the way I imagine he documented safety incidents during his years at Suncor. Date, time, what was said, who was present, what the potential consequences could have been. He wrote that a family member had attempted to arrange the discharge or transfer of a post-surgical patient against medical advice, and that in his opinion, the motivation was not the patient's well-being, but the family member's personal schedule. He asked the hospital to keep the record on file in case it was ever needed. He didn't tell me this. Priya told me because she thought I should know. She said, "That man cares about you more than he lets on." I smiled when she said that, because I already knew. You learn to read people quickly in emergency nursing, and Douglas was the kind of person whose caring was quiet and structural. Like the beams inside a wall. You don't see them, but they are the reason the house stands up. Over the months that followed, my relationship with my parents changed in ways that were both gradual and absolute. My mother continued to call occasionally, but the calls had a quality to them that I can only describe as transactional. She called when she needed something or when she wanted to report something. She called to tell me that Jenna was pregnant. She called to ask whether I could contribute to a group gift for my father's 60th birthday. She never once asked about my surgery. She never asked about the scar. She never asked who had taken care of me. It was as if the entire event had been filed away in her mind under inconvenient things that happened to other people, and the drawer had been closed. My father and I exchanged texts occasionally, short, surface-level messages. Happy Thanksgiving. How's the weather there? The banality of it should have hurt, but it didn't, because I had stopped expecting anything else. You cannot be disappointed by people once you have accepted who they are instead of who you wish they were. That acceptance is not the same as forgiveness. It is more like setting down a suitcase you have been carrying up a hill your entire life and realizing that nothing inside it was yours to begin with. Douglas and Linda became, and I do not use this word lightly, my family. They had me over for dinner on Sundays. Linda made roast chicken and potatoes and a Caesar salad that she was unreasonably proud of, and she was right to be because it was excellent. Douglas would sit at the head of the table and eat quietly and occasionally say something funny in such a deadpan way that you would miss it if you weren't paying attention. Russ would lie under the table and rest his chin on my foot, and I would feed him small pieces of chicken when Linda wasn't looking, although I'm fairly certain she was always looking and simply chose not to say anything. They told me about their own children. A son in Fort McMurray who worked in the trades, a daughter in Vancouver who was a high school teacher. They spoke about them with warmth and pride and a kind of steady, uncomplicated love that I found almost disorienting, because it was so different from what I had grown up with. In my family, love was conditional. It was a currency you earned by performing correctly, by being convenient, by not causing problems, by showing up at weddings with ruptured organs if that was what the occasion required. In the Beaulieu household, love was not a currency. It was just the weather. It was always there. You didn't have to earn the sun. I went back to work 8 weeks after my surgery. My first shift back was a night shift in the emergency department, and within the first hour, a young woman came in, maybe 22, 23, with a dislocated shoulder from a fall on an icy sidewalk. She was in pain and she was scared and she was alone. I sat with her while we waited for the physician. I held her hand. I talked to her the way Douglas had talked to me in his truck, steady and low, about nothing in particular, just enough sound to remind her that she was not alone in the room. When the physician arrived and they began to reduce the dislocation, I stayed. I didn't need to. My job was done. But I stayed because I understood now, in a way I hadn't fully understood before, that presence is not a small thing. It is sometimes the entire thing. 2 months after I went back to work, I got a text from my sister. It was long, by Jenna's standards, which meant it was about 4 sentences. She said she was sorry she hadn't called. She said she hadn't known the full extent of what had happened until recently. She said our mother had told her it was a routine procedure and that I was fine. She said, I should have called you myself. I'm sorry, Meg. I stared at that text for a long time. Jenna and I had never been close. Not because we didn't like each other, but because my mother had always positioned us as competitors rather than allies. There was always a favorite, and the favorite was always whichever daughter was being more useful at any given moment. We had been trained, from childhood, to see each other's needs as threats to our own. It was a subtle and effective cruelty, the kind that doesn't leave bruises but leaves you unable to trust the people you should have been able to trust most. I wrote back, thank you. I mean that. It was not a reconciliation. It was a crack in a wall that might someday become a door. I'll take it. Last October, Douglas and Linda invited me to Thanksgiving dinner. Their son had come down from Fort Mac, and their daughter had flown in from Vancouver with her partner and their baby, a 7-month-old named Eloise, who had Douglas's eyes and Linda's complete disregard for sleeping at appropriate times. The table was loud and crowded, and there was too much food, and someone spilled cranberry sauce on the tablecloth, and nobody cared. Douglas carved the turkey and served everyone before himself, and when Linda brought out the pie, she set it on the table and said, to nobody in particular and to everyone at once, I am thankful for every single person at this table. She looked at me when she said it. Not pointedly. Not with any great drama. Just a glance, a small nod, the kind of look that says you belong here and you always will. I drove home that night on the Henday, the same highway I had been driven to the hospital on 9 months earlier, and the northern lights were out. They were green and faint, barely there, more like a suggestion of light than the real thing. But they were there. And I pulled over on the shoulder and I sat in my car and I watched them, and I thought about how Douglas had described seeing them from the oil sands work camp. So bright they looked fake. These ones didn't look fake. They looked fragile and real and temporary and beautiful, the way most true things are. I think about that night on my kitchen floor more often than I would like. Not the pain, though I remember the pain. What I think about is the silence. 14 calls and nobody answered. The ringing that just kept going, over and over, into nothing. I think about the fact that I lay on that floor for almost 40 minutes alone, before a man I barely knew heard me through a wall and came. And then I think about what came after. The truck ride, the surgery, the Tim Hortons double-doubles, the frozen meals labeled by day, the warm socks from Mark's, the Sunday dinners, the Caesar salad, the old beagle with his chin on my foot. The woman who told me that family is whoever opens the door and walks in when the world has walked out. My parents gave me a name and a childhood and a deeply ingrained belief that love was something you had to earn. Douglas and Linda gave me a ride to the hospital and a stocked fridge and a seat at their table, and the quiet, unshakable proof that love is not something you earn at all. It is something someone decides to give you, freely, without conditions, without keeping score, without a spreadsheet or a seating chart or a laminated plan. If this story reached you today, I want you to hear this. The people who show up for you when everything falls apart, even if they are strangers, even if they are quiet, even if they never ask for a single thing in return, those people are showing you what it actually looks like when someone cares. And sometimes the hardest thing is not surviving the emergency. Sometimes the hardest thing is realizing that the people who should have come were never going to, and that the people who did come are the ones who were meant to be there all along. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of someone who showed up for you, or made you think about someone you could show up for, please subscribe to this channel. Every week we share true stories of survival, betrayal, unexpected kindness, and the kind of love that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives when it's needed most. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and be part of a community that believes real stories deserve to be heard. Your being here matters, and so does every story we tell. This story is for everyone who has ever called for help and heard only silence, and for everyone who has ever heard that silence through a wall and decided to walk through the door anyway.